Thank you very much, Lawrence and Corinna. I think that this is a fantastic report. It contains a lot of very hard-hitting data and numbers, and I think clear course for action for all of us. I would like to now invite the panel to come and join us on stage. We have a very distinguished panel today with Sanjeev Gupta, who's the Deputy Director of Fiscal Affairs at the IMF, Asma Latif, who's Director of the Bread for the World Institute, Robert Bertram, Chief Scientist, Feed the Future, Bureau for Food Security at USAID, Stephen Jaffe, who's the lead agriculture economist at the World Bank, and Michael Jacobson, Executive Director, Center for Science in the Public Interest. And I'm Augustin Fleury, the Executive Director for Nutrition at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and I had the honor to be co-chair of the stakeholder group of the Nutrition Report. So, distinguished panelists, I think we're running a bit behind, so I'm going to ask you to be brief in your answers. But let's start the conversation by asking each of you, what is your favorite number from the GNR and why? And let's start with Robert and go down in order.
It's hard to have a favorite number when most of them are about bad things. So, but I would say the most important numbers from my perspective are the number of people in the world, the 750 million or so, who still do not have adequate caloric and protein nutrition, plus the 2 billion more who are suffering from micronutrient deficiency. And I say this because I feel that the difference between no choice of food to eat at all or only poor choices of food to eat are things that rise to the very top of our moral imperative in terms of assuring a good life for our fellow human beings. But having said that, one of the great things about having been in AID in the last 5 years, 7 years, with Feed the Future and ending preventable maternal and child deaths at birth, is that we have brought people and agriculture together, food, nutrition, and agriculture. So we're really measuring things now by stunting reduction. So I think, having said that, in terms of the big number, the one that we're watching very closely is we're trying to reduce stunting by 20% in the zones where we work, and also to reduce maternal mortality and child mortality as well. So those are the numbers that communicate most strongly to me.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll have a follow-up question for you if we have time afterwards. Let's move to Sanjeev. What is your favorite number in the GNR?
Well, one thing that I found very intriguing was the high benefit cost ratio of interventions in the nutrition area, which seems to suggest that any spending on nutrition is productive from the perspective of allocations, budget allocations. So that's, for me, that's an important number to remember. The second one is that you need about $10 billion to take care of nutritional programs across the world. And that number is not very large, looking at the allocations that we have. And so, so that 10 billion can easily be generated through revenues by improving existing expenditures, efficiency, or by taxing some sin goods. So it's not a very large amount that we need to raise to be able to cover this productive spending. And one could here also think of taxation on, let's say, one is sugar and fat, which is something we don't really talk too much about. Mexico started by taxing sodas, and so that's another dimension which would have an indirect effect on nutrition or on the health status of the population. And the other one is, we recently came up with the number that the global fossil fuel subsidies amount to about $5.6 trillion, which is about 6% of the global GDP. Now, these subsidies, of course, these are broadly defined, including the externalities that arise from consumption of fossil fuels. Now, if you were to tax fossil fuels right, then you would have positive impact on the health status of the population, because 80% of the benefits from higher taxation will accrue to local population from a smaller number of deaths from accidents and from pollution and so on and so forth. So there are a number of things that one could do to support this objective of, and finally, I also, it's not a number, but just a message that the spending on or to improve nutrition, one has to look at programs across a range of things. And this is an important message because you need to look at education, you look at health, you need to look at social safety nets, all kind of stuff has to be looked at. And that I think is another message which is important.
Thank you very much. Asma.
So I had picked a number that Lawrence talked at length about, which was the 39 increase in the number of countries that are on target now to achieve the World Health Assembly target on stunting, up from 23. So I will switch my number and focus on the 33% increase in income if that is in a chart that shows if from a study in Brazil, I believe, for people who for women who breastfeed over a year. So that is, again, it goes to the issue of the economic return, and it's a very powerful statistic, and it's an area where, while the World Health is, it's an area where we are struggling to make progress, and it's an area that's not reflected in the SDGs. I was also thinking about another number, but not a number that was in the report specifically, but it's the number 2. And 2, because the SDG, number 2, does specifically mention nutrition. It's a huge step forward from the MDGs, and I think we have to stop and recognize that. 2, because target 2.2 is ending malnutrition in all its forms. And in that target, there's specific reference to 2 World Health Assembly targets, stunting and wasting. And so while breastfeeding is not currently mentioned in the way the SDGs have been formulated, and by the way, I think they were approved just now at the start of the SDG summit, so we are in a different time now, and we should stop and celebrate that. Yes. So we have our work cut out for us, and Lawrence and the report really underscore the need for advocacy over the next few months to really ensure that the World Health Assembly targets that have really galvanized the focus through Nutrition for Growth and the Scaling Up Nutrition, and given us specific targets to work towards. We have some work to do to build the bridge between what the SDGs say and the World Health Assembly targets. The SDGs also speak specifically about 2025 for stunting and wasting, and there are no specific numbers out to 2030. So there are 2 exercises here. One is working over the next few months to really make sure that indicators are reflected under other SDGs, because the report does a wonderful job of showing how nutrition is integral to a number of goals. So for example, ending preventable child deaths. No mention of nutrition there, but we know that 45% of child deaths, preventable child deaths, is due to undernutrition. So how can we better reflect the nutrition aspect through the choice of indicators that the UN will put forward? And we have a window. The group that's pulling together the estimates for, or the proposals for indicators will do that at the beginning of next year. So there's advocacy that could be done here in Washington, in New York, but also at the country level.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you. I think this is, we have to indeed stop and recognize the fact that there is now a global goal to end malnutrition in all its forms. This is the first time, and this is fantastic. We need to get those indicators right. I think the window of opportunity, from what I hear, is actually smaller. It's in the next month or two. So anyone who can advocate should do so. Let me move on to Mike. And Mike, what is your favorite number in the report?
Well, there are a lot of numbers in the report. You know, at first I was, and I'm thinking Lawrence is probably thinking, you know, they're like kids. I love them all. But first I was thinking about the obesity numbers. You know, where you look at national rates of adult obesity, and it's 20%, 30%, 35%, even higher than 35%. These numbers are shocking. But it really hits home when you look at diabetes rates. And 1 out of 12 adults has diabetes. And when you think about the pain, the amputations, the blindnesses, the heart attacks, it's just heartbreaking to think that that many people are at risk. And then when you think about national health budgets, diabetes is going to break the banks of all these countries. And we haven't seen diabetes rates crest. Obesity rates are still rising. Diets in many countries are getting worse. And I think health ministers really need to pay close attention to use diabetes rates as an indicator, and there are many things that can be done to try to reverse that epidemic of diabetes, and maybe we'll talk about that.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
Yep.
Last but not least.
My favorite number is number 1, and it's because it relates to one theme that I think the report dealt with exceptionally well, and one theme that I think next year's report can relate to exceptionally well. I was also struck with the obesity numbers. Essentially, there's one country in the world that has achieved some reduction in male obesity, and that country is Nauru, which happens to have a population of 11,000 people. And even if you mix in the full population, the females and males, the obesity rate's going up there. The report points out that the SDG report does not mention the word obesity once. And I think we're facing sort of a perfect storm right now, because we're seeing rising urbanization rates, we're seeing rising expenditures on processed foods. And in North America, at least, right now, selling fat, sugar, and salt is no longer very popular, right? So we're pushing back, we're looking for fresh and more healthy diet. So where are the companies going to sell their fat, sugar, and salt? I think we're looking at sort of a tobacco phenomenon here, where essentially demand contracted in wealthy countries, and the next generation of demand is in middle-income countries. And it's disturbing that doesn't seem that we have any answers, even in the northern countries, in terms of changing behavior and whatnot. Number 1 is also a number I pulled from looking at the breakdown of the country's performance in realizing the World Health Assembly targets. When I was going down that table, I looked at the countries who have achieved 1 of the 6, and I was quite struck because a number of these countries, Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ethiopia, have increased their agricultural expenditure quite significantly in the last 5 to 10 years in the orientation toward improved food security or national self-sufficiency in food. felt there seems to be a disconnect between a number of, in many countries, I think, between food security policies, between the pattern of public expenditure in agriculture, and realizing nutritional outcomes. And I think it is something we should be looking at more. We do a lot of public expenditure analysis in agriculture without a nutrition lens, looking at irrigation spending a little bit differently, research and expenditure. And I'd be interested if anybody has done this or knows of a good methodology to apply. So I think in sort of next year's work, maybe this is a topic to look at. Generally, the connections between the food security, the language of ministries of agriculture and nutrition, there's still a gap. You can't talk stunting in a meeting with the Minister of Agriculture, generally. The eyes are sort of rolling over. So that whole dialogue where many ministries of agriculture do not view themselves as in the nutrition outcome business, they're in the production business. And crossing that bridge may be a way of identifying some of the resources that need to be spent on nutrition. A lot of money is being spent on fertilizer subsidies and other things, which at best have a sort of neutral nutritional impacts. And maybe a lot of agricultural spending is nutrition insensitive. Thank you,
Stephen. I just want to pick on the issue of communication and language, because I think this is something that we really all need to reflect on. We're very good at talking to ourselves as a community, but as soon as we start talking to other communities, stunting and wasting and all the acronyms get people lost, and we lose the audience. So that's something that I think we should all focus on going forward. We're running a bit late. I want to do one very quick follow-up with each of you, and then we'll open for Q&A with the co-chairs of the independent expert group for any questions on the report, as well as any questions for the panelists. So if you can respond to me in 1 minute or less, I'll do a quick round of follow-ups. Robert, the US government is the world's biggest nutrition donor. What do we need to do to protect and expand assistance levels as we head into an election year?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one.
In less than 1 minute.
Well, I think I'm going to say what I'd like to say rather than try to answer that. I think accountability is incredibly important, and we are moving the needle on stunting. This is huge news. This is really news in the last decade, to see countries all over the world, many in Africa, some in Asia, that are really bringing stunting down. And that reflects a holistic approach that looks at water and sanitation, it looks at food, it looks at healthcare, it looks at behavior change communication, and so forth. But I think, importantly, I want to say the report is wonderfully holistic, but for me that's also a challenge, because it's not one size fits all. For example, we are working really hard to increase the availability and affordability of animal source foods, milk, eggs, poultry, fish, meat, all of it, especially for women and children. And that, I worry sometimes that message, which might not resonate here or in Western Europe or elsewhere, is still incredibly important for people who don't have these in their diet because they can't afford them. Now, there's many things we do that are income insensitive. For example, we're working on diet diversity, vegetables, fruit, legumes. And on the health side, we're working on things like exclusive breastfeeding, or again, support to pregnant mothers in terms of information and care and so forth. So there's a lot of things that do cut across all income groups, but we really want to stay very focused on people for whom a cup of milk a day would make an enormous difference in the life of a child and that child's ability to grow and prosper. So I just want to be sure that, we support the holistic approach, but we have to claim really one piece of it.
Agreed, and thank you for not answering the question so brilliantly.
Hard one.
Sanjeev, you wrote in a recent blog about public health spending that it makes good sense for macroeconomists to pay attention to health indicators and their drivers. What about nutrition? When does undernutrition, obesity, NCDs, when do they become matters of macroeconomic concern? In less than 1 minute again.
Yeah. No, I mean, we do recognize the importance of spending on health and nutrition on economic growth. I was a member of the Lancet Health Commission that was chaired by Larry Summers and Dean Jemison. And we did focus a lot on these issues. We also focused on non-communicable diseases, the things that we've been discussing here. And so for us, the issue is, how do we help countries create fiscal space to be able to provide more room for productive spending? And that fiscal space can be created through higher revenue mobilization, which is now one of the key goals under the Financing for Development program, and then and by improving the efficiency of spending existing programs, because there's a lot of money which is being spent, but is not being spent well. So these are the things which would help countries move forward in terms of achieving their goals.
Thank you. Asma, based on your experience, let's talk about communications and raising the profile of nutrition. What stories, what images, what narratives work best in capturing the hearts of US voters and putting pressure on Congress people about nutrition?
Well, I think in the US, there has been a very strong national nutrition programs, the school lunches and program, but in particular the Women, Infant, and Children program. And so Americans are very a soft spot for this. They understand this very, very personally. I think women in particular have a strong understanding of this. And so I think mostly it's an issue of helping them understand it in the context of women everywhere. And I think the SDG agenda with the universality helps connect people here with people around the world. And the cost effectiveness argument is really helpful in making that case to Congress, especially in a fiscally austere time. I think the communications effort really needs to be speaking about it from the context of programs that are working here at home and are really preventing increases in health costs over time, and then also making that link globally. And I think the issue around obesity and the challenge of obesity that is emerging in developing countries will help. It's a challenge we face here at home as well. And so that's another way to help make that connection of these are preventative interventions and investments. And in this time, those are the kinds of arguments that need to be made.
Thank you, and that's a perfect transition to my question for Mike. In your experience, what can the rest of the world learn from the US experience of fighting obesity? And the corollary, what can the US learn from the experience of others?
You know, the image that comes to mind as we're talking here, and you know, there's a very careful documentation in the report and those details, and these committees developing science-based recommendations, all that careful work. And outside the room, you know, picture just out here on K Street, a giant 20 stories tall with a huge sledgehammer is coming in and shaking everything up. And that's how I see the soft drink industry. Listen to these numbers. This is Coca-Cola's investments in China, $4 billion over 3 years. In Mexico, $6 billion over 5 years. Brazil, $6 billion over 5 years. India, $5 billion over 8 years. Africa, $12 billion over 10 years. Think of that money. It's creating bottling plants, vending machines, coolers, advertising. the works. They're going to have a huge impact on obesity. They've had it here. As you mentioned, we're reversing the soda consumption rate. Soda consumption in the US is down 25% in 15 years. Huge decrease. So the companies like the tobacco industry, they're going overseas with these kinds of investments, and they're going to shake everything up. And in the process, probably buying trade ministers, politicians of every stripe. And worse, they're going after kids. Coke and Pepsi say they're not going after kids, but you'll find Coke and Pepsi in school stores. The companies sponsor kids' sports teams. There's schools that have welcome signs that have the big Coca-Cola logo on them. In elementary schools, it's so brazen. They're, I don't want to use the word indoctrinating, but I will. Brand name indoctrination is what it's called. And it's shameful. And I don't think you know better than I do about, what's going on within governments. I suspect that health ministers say, oh, people don't consume much sugar drinks in our country, so it's not a concern. And the trade ministers say, we see billions of dollars of investments. Let's go for it. And then once consumption increases to a certain point, the industry, the multinationals, the locals, the retailers have built up enough political power that it's very difficult to do anything about the problem. Latin American countries are beginning to. Mexico slapped a tax on soda. Ecuador and Chile have better nutrition labeling that highlights sugar contents. Chile says excessive in sugar. And in the United States, people are mounting education campaigns, trying to get taxes. We're trying to get warning labels on soft drinks. All kinds of measures that really would have an impact. And the biggest thing, the thing that would solve the problem is to set a limit on the sugar content of sugary drinks at roughly 1/4 of current levels. That would pretty much solve the problem. But we need health ministers to take action, and we need a lot of grassroots activists to light fires under them.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad that we only have water on this table. Steve, very quickly, just want to move to the link between nutrition, food, and climate change. You've done a lot of work on green agriculture. And the worlds of nutrition and climate on the face of it do not necessarily have very much in common, but the report tries to make some of those links. What can we do to connect those agendas better? And what is your recommendation in 1 minute?
Yeah. Let me try to make the connection. I think water is actually a very significant connection. Water productivity, particularly because Coca-Cola needs all the water, right? So agriculture is going to be using much less water because of competition from other uses. So getting sort of a higher nutritional bang per drop of water is going to be a big challenge. Water quality, water pollution from agriculture due to animal waste and other. That sort of feeds then through the whole food safety aspect. And so waterborne problems and foodborne affecting young children and whatnot. So that connection, let's see, the whole meat-rich diets. What's the trajectory of this? Are we looking at industrial size operations all over the world, which will meet demand, but will be contributing much higher levels of sort of waste, again, into soil, into water, and dealing with that. I think the companies that are on some of the forefront on sustainable agriculture are also branded food companies. Whether or not there's a marriage there in terms of the agendas, I don't know, but possibly. So, look, I don't have a 1-second solution on this subject.
We'll do with what you give us. Thank you very much.